This video is brought to you by Mubi, an online cinema streaming hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe. Get 1 month free at mubi.com/likestoriesofold. I think most of us can remember when we first discovered The Lord of the Rings. Whether you were introduced through the films or through the books, the feeling of being transported so completely to a world beyond our own is not easily forgotten. It is undeniably one of the great stories of our time, not only because it serves as well-written escapism, but also because it touches on something deeper, something essential that clearly touched the hearts of many. When creating the world of Middle-earth, Tolkien was heavily inspired by the myths of old, taking influences from Norse paganism as found in, for example, the Poetic Edda and the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, but it was his own Christianity that ultimately shaped The Lord of the Rings into what he himself believes to be a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. At first glance, we indeed find a lot of Christian imagery in The Lord of the Rings. There are angels and demons, heaven and hell, temptation, resurrection, and a clear distinction between a physical and spiritual reality. This, however, does not mean the story is a Christian allegory. In fact, Tolkien famously disliked allegories, stating he rather prefers history, be it real or fictional. He was particularly fond of mythology, especially fairy tales, because, in his words, they open a door on other time, and if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself maybe. When written successfully, such journeys beyond our own world allow us to glimpse at the deeper meanings that are not bound by any time or place, but that are universal to all. There is indeed no better medium for moral teaching than the good fairy story. And this is what made The Lord of the Rings such a phenomenal success, as one author comments. Exploring Tolkien's world was not just interesting, it was not even just fascinating, it was sheer joy. For we knew that here we had touched truth. This book was a homecoming, this book broke our hearts. Here was a world that was real. In fact, more real, more solid than the one we left behind when we opened the covers of that book.
And cut! That's great, we'll jig the gate.
In his ambitious task of translating The Lord of the Rings to film, Peter Jackson understood the mythological essence of Tolkien's work, approaching it not as a whimsical fantasy, but as actual history.
I said, look, we've been given the job of making The Lord of the Rings, but I want to, from this point on, I want to think that The Lord of the Rings is real, that it was actually history, that these events happened. And more than that, I want us to imagine that we've been lucky enough to be able to go on location and shoot our movie where the real events happened.
On top of that, he was able to use the specific qualities of cinema to not only adapt, but also expand on Tolkien's mythology. Most notably by using New Zealand's natural beauty to give Middle-earth the strong sense of place that makes it feel both otherworldly as well as intimately familiar. And by composing a vast soundtrack that uses musical leitmotifs to enrich the various cultural histories and ground us even further into this world as one that actually exists. To me, these are the elements that have since become inseparable from Tolkien's work, and perhaps even vital to understanding it in its fullness. And so today, I want to use both Tolkien's worldview and Jackson's cinematic vision to explore the underlying truth that The Lord of the Rings reveals, and examine its deeper workings and power as a mythology. My interpretation is mainly based on the books Following Gandalf, Epic Battles and Moral Victory in The Lord of the Rings by Matthew Dickerson, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth by Bradley Berzer, and The Philosophy of Tolkien, The Worldview Behind The Lord of the Rings by Peter Kraft. Although these sources are about Tolkien's writing and not Peter Jackson's adaptation of that writing, the essence of the important themes are considered to be preserved well enough, and so I will discuss the books and films interchangeably unless the differences are significant enough to be worth mentioning. With that in mind, let's begin our journey into the vast landscapes of Middle-earth, immerse ourselves in the sights and sounds that gave it life, and explore the deeper meanings that turned an epic adventure into a mythology for the ages. We begin in Rohan, with the people who most resemble the Anglo-Saxons in their cultural aesthetics and musical themes. When we first enter the city of Edoras, we find a land in decline that has lost its glory and spirit, and whose king is but a pale shadow of the man he once was. It captures the bleakness that was at the heart of many pagan mythologies, a vision of a doomed world, soon to be destroyed by the gods or by time. Yet it is in this struggle with mortality that Tolkien, very much like the poet who wrote Beowulf, finds the pagans' most noble virtues, courage and raw will. Indeed, much of the main story arc of the people of Rohan is centered around reclaiming these virtues. When we first meet Theoden, his mind is corrupted by Saruman, but even after he is released from his spell, his spirit has not been fully restored. He still finds himself trapped, he is still afraid to face death and mortality, and so instead of facing his enemies head-on as Gandalf urges him to,
"You must fight,"
he retreats his people to Helm's Deep to be locked away in a giant fortress.
I know what it is you want of me, but I will not bring further death to my people. I will not risk open war.
It is only after being besieged by the Uruk-hai, at the very last moment when death is upon him and his people, that Theoden rediscovers the spirit of his ancestors.
"Ride out with me."
And faces his doom with courage.
For death and glory.
But his journey does not end here, as Tolkien believed that the best qualities of the pagan world shouldn't be merely adopted. They should be appropriated and recontextualized into Christianity, and in that process be sanctified. The most important aspect of this was to separate these virtues from the glorification of war and death in battle that is found in much of the language and literature of the Anglo-Saxons. Although Tolkien valued the will to fight and the courage to sacrifice oneself, he did not believe in achieving glory through great deeds of violence or death in battle. And so Theoden is spared from death at Helm's Deep. The restoration of his spirit is not yet complete. But before we continue his character arc, I think it's useful to consider that of Éowyn, who perhaps best exemplifies Tolkien's sanctification of the pagans' noble virtues.
Who knows what you've spoken to the darkness, when all your life seems to shrink, the walls of your bower closing in about you.
When we meet Éowyn, she too is trapped by fear, but unlike Theoden, it is not death that scares her.
"What do you fear, my lady?"
A cage. To stay behind bars until use and old age accept them. And all chance of valor has gone beyond recall or desire.
And the cage is exactly what she finds herself in, but it is not necessarily because she was forced to take care of Theoden, or because she is excluded from warfare due to her gender. Her cage is the belief that real honor is only found in battle.
I'm to be sent with the women into the caves.
That is an honorable charge.
To mind the children, to find food and bedding when the men return. What renown is there in that?
As author Matthew Dickerson puts it, while her uncle is so afraid of death that he has become shameful, she is so afraid of shame that she seeks death. Aragorn does represent the battle-hardened heroism that Éowyn admires, and she becomes attracted to him. But Aragorn eventually rejects her, making it clear that the image she projects on him, and by extension the ideal of honor in battle, is mistaken.
It is but a shadow and a thought that you love.
And so while breaking out of her gender role to take part in the war is definitely part of her character arc, it's not its final destination. Which is why, after finally riding into battle and slaying the Witch King, a deed that is certainly great enough for her to die with honor, she too is spared from death. As briefly mentioned in the beginning, Middle-earth is separated in a physical and spiritual reality, and it is the latter one that was most important for Tolkien, and where we find the essence of his sanctification. What he wanted from his characters was not a great deed in battle, nor a glorious death, for those would reach their conclusion in the physical world. Instead, he wanted them to use their courage to achieve a victory in the spiritual realm. He wanted them to have a moral victory. Theoden achieves that victory when he shows courage not only for his own people, but for those of Gondor as well.
Gun knuckles for 8!
Rohan will answer.
He rides out again, this time not because he seeks death or glory, but because it is the right thing to do. And so when he reaches the Pelennor Fields, the outcome of the battle no longer matters for him. It was his choice to give himself to this greater cause that granted him his moral victory, and made him a true king, worthy of the highest honor.
I go to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed.
The completion of Eowyn's story is slightly different, but similar in spirit. She survives the Battle of Pelennor Fields and, during her recovery, falls in love with Faramir, who in the books helps her to see there's no shame in pity, for that is the gift of a gentle heart, to which Eowyn eventually replies, I will be a shield maiden no longer, nor vie with the great riders, nor take joy only in the songs of slaying. I will be a healer, and love all things that grow and are not barren. Her moral victory comes when she realizes there is honor outside of battle, and gives up her pursuit of military glory to instead devote herself to a life of love and compassion. Now, a lot could be said about the journey of a woman learning the value of a domestic life, and the bigger issue of gender roles in Middle-earth, but it should be noted that Eowyn's character arc is very similar to that of Faramir, who was also spared from what would have been a pointless death born out of a desperate hope for glory, and given mercy instead. It does suggest that Tolkien was making a point that transcends gender, especially considering that Faramir and Eowyn go on to live a life that is not unlike his dearest characters. Let us cross the river, Faramir says to Eowyn in the book, and in happier days let us dwell in fair Ithilien and there make a garden. All things will grow with joy there. That Tolkien valued moral victories above all else can be traced all the way back to The Hobbit, where we find that one of the most important moments revolves around a moral choice. Here Bilbo is trying to escape the tunnels while wearing the ring. Gollum, however, blocks his way out. The safest option would be to kill the violent creature as it is unarmed and unaware of Bilbo's presence. But just as he is about to stab Gollum, Bilbo is overcome by pity and chooses to spare his life even though it puts himself at a greater risk. The moment signifies an issue that becomes more prominent in The Lord of the Rings. Let's move to Gondor. Although named the City of Kings, it has been a long time since Minas Tirith has had an actual king. Instead, it is ruled by the steward Denethor, who especially in the film represents a man who is solely focused on maintaining his reign. He wants to ensure victory in the physical realm at any cost, even when that means using the ring, the ultimate weapon of evil, against his enemies.
It should have been brought back to the citadel to be kept safe, not to be used, unless at the uttermost end of need.
By contrast, his son Faramir also wants to protect the city, but not at any cost, not at the cost of evil.
I would not use the ring. Not if Minas Tirith were falling in ruin and I alone could save her.
Although Faramir immediately rejects the ring in the book, the film gives him a bit more of a journey to get to this point. Nevertheless, in both versions, Faramir defines a line that cannot be crossed, a point after which defeat is more desirable than victory. A question that often arises in time of war is what are we willing to sacrifice for victory? And while this is obviously a question that many, if not all, characters face, Tolkien seems to turn this question around to ask an equally important one. For what values are we willing to suffer defeat? This question is especially relevant to the dilemma faced by Galadriel, because whereas Gondor still has a fighting chance even without the ring, Galadriel faces certain defeat regardless of her decision. This is because her home Lothlorien is sustained by the magic of one of the rings of power given to the elves by Sauron. The power of this ring is, however, directly tied to the power of the One Ring, meaning that its destruction would also mean the destruction of Lothlorien. And so when Frodo offers her the One Ring, she is, perhaps more than any other character, tempted to take it. And yet still she resists, and makes the ultimate sacrifice to achieve a moral victory.
I pass the test. I will diminish and go into the west. and remain Galadriel.
Knowing how important it was for Tolkien to have his characters achieve a moral victory, we can begin to understand what makes the ring so fundamentally evil. To put it simply, achieving a moral victory requires choice, and choice requires freedom, and this is exactly what the ring takes away.
One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them.
The purpose of the ring is to dominate other minds, to enslave them, and to place its own will upon them, thereby taking away the freedom of others to make their own choices, the very freedom that makes heroism and moral victories possible. The ring, of course, is an extension of Sauron, whose only cause is ultimate power and domination.
And into this ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life.
The ring recognizes no other authority than its creator, which also explains why trying to use the ring for military achievements is not an option, for this would still lead to a defeat, as those under the ring's influence will eventually succumb to its corruption and end up a slave under Sauron's dominion. Sauron's power is singular. It does not desire friends or allies. It does not work towards a greater good. It's an end in itself, like a black hole consuming everything it touches. Instead of building connections, it breaks them. Instead of virtue, it wants obedience.
There is only one Lord of the Ring, and he does not share power.
As we see on more than one occasion, this manipulation of the mind happens without the knowledge of those who are being manipulated. The ring deceives through illusions of grandeur, often by giving its victims the false belief that it can be used for good. For this, it needs darkness, it needs to operate in secrecy, as is symbolized by the power of invisibility the ring gives to its carrier. Invisibility, however, also implies isolation, as Peter Kraft explains. The ring cuts us off from community and contact. We are alone with the eye. There's no room for two eyes, no room for another in the one ring. But it is in this isolation that we also find its weakness, for power is limited to itself. It knows force, pride and selfishness, but not gentleness, humility and empathy. It knows how to take, but not how to sacrifice. And here we find a shimmer of hope, an unexpected advantage, but only if we're brave enough to use it, only if we have the courage to do what's right. Still, it might not seem like such values are enough to stand a fighting chance against the might of Sauron and the sheer force of its devastation. And indeed, the quest to destroy the ring often feels like a hopeless one. But in Tolkien's Middle-earth, there are other forces at play, forces that give spiritual victories a greater purpose, that give even the smallest moral decisions cosmic significance. And although they only show themselves implicitly, they play a vital role in the fate of Middle-earth, and might even form the very essence of Tolkien's mythology. The main purpose of this channel is to explore how films can enrich us as human beings, and so I'm always excited to discover new films that give me insights into time periods, countries or subjects I'm not familiar with. However, such films are not always easy to find, and so I was really glad to have discovered Mubi. Mubi is an online cinema streaming a hand-picked selection of films from around the globe. Every day they present a new film, and every day they take one away. Whether it's a timeless classic, a thought-provoking documentary, or an acclaimed masterpiece, there are always 30 perfectly curated films to discover. It's a simple but highly effective way to start exploring the riches of cinema. And I'm happy to share this with you by offering 30 days for free. So head on over to mubi.com/likestoriesofold to begin your extended free trial today.